to Education Professionals, where we explore the issues that shape our classrooms. I'm Dan Gaskin, and today we're looking at a fundamental topic in Australian education, how Indigenous knowledge and histories are being integrated into the national curriculum. Despite decades of advocacy for Indigenous rights and recognition, there is still a long way to go in ensuring that Indigenous perspectives are truly embedded in our education systems. For instance, the Australian Teachers Survey 2023 found that over 51% of teachers aged 35 and over felt unprepared to deal with First Nations histories, cultures, and student diversity. Additionally, the Australian government pledged an extra $18.6 billion over 10 years under Gaskin 2.0, which aims to improve equity in education. A portion of this funding targets Indigenous students who continue to experience disproportionately lower educational outcomes. In this episode, we'll be exploring how Indigenous perspectives are being included, the challenges involved, and what the future holds for Indigenous education in Australia. Indigenous perspectives in education are not just about learning the history of First Nations peoples. In the 2022 edition of Powers of Curriculum, Gobby and Walker emphasised the importance of integrating Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum to promote cultural awareness and inclusivity. By facilitating a deeper understanding of Australia's past, present and future, students are not only learning about Indigenous history, but also about Indigenous culture, worldviews and ways of knowing that have been passed down for generations. To discuss this further, we're joined by Lizzie Marnie, an educator at Brighton High School in South Australia and a strong advocate for Indigenous education. Lizzie, can you explain why it's crucial for Indigenous perspectives to be included in Australian education?
Yeah, hi Dan, great question. So it is super important to include Indigenous perspectives across the board in Australian education, and that's from really early on all the way to universities and TAFE settings. So one of the first reasons I think is that because it's really important that all Australians have a really solid understanding of our history. So I think that part of the massive problem is that Australians struggle to recognise and reconcile really with such a history of violence. Because we are such a young country, it does mean acknowledging that, you know, your great-grandparents, your grandparents potentially were involved in direct colonisation, and that you yourself or your parents are sort of profiteering or benefiting in some way from that colonisation. That does continue to this day. So understanding our history is understanding that Aboriginal Australians have been on this continent for more than 65,000 years. You know, we say 65,000 years, the latest evidence is now 85 to 90,000 years, finding some art in WA depicting megafauna that kind of possibly been on this continent around 65,000 years ago. So it's really, really important that we acknowledge that. And it's sad in a way that we don't, because what a great advantage we could have to take on board this history and be proud of it. You know, there are terrible things that have happened, but there are also some wonderful ancient stories and ancient traditions and histories and all of the things that have happened that are really beneficial, and that knowledge should be shared and should be celebrated. You know, how fantastic if we could have real Indigenous history acknowledged, and we could have, you know, the potential for great tourism opportunities in Australia where we really are proud of it. You know, the pyramids are only about 3,000 years old. We've got history way more important than that. The next reason I would say is to make sure that we're looking at cultural respect and reconciliation. So including those perspectives in education, it does actually help break down those misconceptions that do contribute to ongoing systematic racism. So it helps us foster this understanding between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, which is crucial for reconciling. The word reconcile means to make friends again. So you could say conciliation really, because we haven't really been friends in the first place. We never really started from a level of friendship. So by learning about experiences and histories and cultures, students are actually better ready to engage in those meaningful discussions and have more inclusive, respectful societies. And that's quite difficult at the moment because we do have an education system which, only in the last couple of years has included a deep time Indigenous history unit in the Year 7 curriculum. Before that, it was just, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, but no actual, recognition of our country.
So, While the benefits of including Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum do seem clear, it's not without its challenges. Some educators feel not adequately prepared or supported to teach the content, and there are structural issues within the curriculum itself that need to be addressed. The inclusion of Indigenous perspectives as a cross-curriculum priority in the Australian curriculum was formally introduced back in 2015. And while that's a positive, Gobby and Walker call out the ongoing gaps in meaningful implementation. And in the publication Indigenous Education in Australia, Excellent Gower go a step further, describing a failure to foster meaningful relationships with Aboriginal students, families and communities, which only reinforces that need for culturally responsive teaching practices. Lizzie, as a teacher who has lived experience, what do you see are the main barriers to integrating Indigenous knowledge into the curriculum?
Again, really complex and different across all different sites. For example, if you were teaching in the APY lands, you might have a better understanding of how to teach Indigenous perspectives. But also, part of the issue is a lot of Australian educators think that, I don't have an Aboriginal student in my class, so why should I need to include that perspective? We're not just including it for that student. And I think that's a big obstacle we come across. The other one is just the lack of education within the system itself. So we have a whole bunch of teachers, not to their own fault. We're not taught any of this in their own education. So they don't have a solid and confident understanding of Indigenous perspectives. But the problem is those educators are not, given the time and the space to learn, within their busy lives. And we don't expect anyone else in their profession to learn, do we? It's not like we give them time and space to learn, but it is expected of educators.
In fact, in Educating Australia, Glenn Savage laments that while educational reforms such as the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures in the Australian curriculum represent an effort to incorporate Indigenous perspectives, teachers require better government and teaching support to shift integration from tokenistic to meaningful. By validating cultural identity, the successful integration of Indigenous perspectives can also provide engagement for Aboriginal learners, which can lead to improved learning outcomes. To give us an example of what's working, we're now joined by Jasmine Ratton, a secondary school teacher at Banksia Park International School in South Australia. Jasmine, can you share some success stories where Indigenous perspectives have been successfully integrated into the curriculum at Banksia Park?
Okay, so one year I taught the same Year 9 class for maths and HAS. Mm-hmm. This class was very diverse, students with different learning needs, cultural backgrounds and language barriers. To meet all the learning needs in the class and include Indigenous perspectives, I created a task focusing on food security in Australia. The students had to design a vertical garden using math skills and HAS skills for their planning and measurements. Mm-hmm. We explored Indigenous agricultural practices like bush tucker and sustainable land management, and the students included native plants and food significant to Indigenous Australians in their designs. This made the task more meaningful and showed how Indigenous knowledge can address real-world issues like sustainability. Mm-hmm. The students really engaged with it. Some international students even incorporated foods from their own cultures alongside native plants, creating this beautiful blend of ideas. I assessed them on their entrepreneurial thinking, adaptability, and how well they used Indigenous perspectives. It gave a lot of ownership of their learning and delivered some innovative and thoughtful designs.
Excellent. So successful stories like this are hopeful signs of progress, showing that with the right approach and support, we can create a more inclusive and equitable education system for all Australians. While support is needed, teachers can cultivate a mindset that prioritises equity, challenges discriminatory practices, and fosters positive relationships between students of all backgrounds. Teachers who proactively integrate Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum challenge the perpetual racial biases that inherently exist. Jasmine, finally, as someone who completed Indigenous studies at university level, how have you seen things change over the years?
Since finishing my studies in Indigenous education in 2019, I've seen big improvements in how it's taught. There's more focus on embedding Indigenous perspectives across all subjects, better professional development for teachers, and tasks and units of work available that are specifically designed to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into the majority of subjects. There is also more involvement from Indigenous communities in the curriculum. These changes have enriched learning and helped foster respect for Indigenous Australians' knowledge and culture.
Thanks, Jasmine. And as further evidenced by today's discussions, integrating Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum is essential for building a more just and inclusive society. While challenges remain, efforts are being made in classrooms across the country to ensure that Indigenous students see themselves represented and that all students have the opportunity to learn about the rich cultural heritage of Australia's First Nations people. It's clear that the journey is ongoing, but the pathway forward is promising. Thank you to both Lizzie and Jasmine for sharing their insights today. If you'd like to learn more about how Indigenous perspectives can be integrated into your classroom, check out the great resources available at the Reconciliation Australia website. This has been Educational Professionals, and I'm Dan Gaskin. Until next time.